Hello. Thank you for joining us, all of you who are here today for this talk with Dr. Jareh Das and Dr. Virginia Nimarkoh, focusing on the practice of artist Donald Rodney. I'm Melanie Pocock, curator at Ikon, and this talk is part of the Migrant Festival and also the public programme for a very special place, Ikon in the 1990s, our current exhibition, which closes on the 30th of August and which features work by Donald Rodney. A little more background about Donald Rodney to begin with. Donald Rodney was born in Birmingham in 1961, and he was a seminal figure in the Black art group. Much of his work dealt with his medical condition, sickle cell disease, from which he eventually passed away in 1998. Rodney featured a lot in Ikon's programme and in the gallery, not just as an artist, but also as a curator and exhibition organiser. His work was featured in exhibitions such as Truth Dare, Double Dare, a collaborative project with artist Rose Finn-Kelcey, and a sound piece from which you can hear in the exhibition, but which we won't play in this talk today, where we'll be focusing more on image-based work by Rodney. Just to outline the format before I introduce both of our wonderful speakers today, Jareh and Virginia will talk for approximately half an hour, and there'll be time at for questions at the end. And I will ask you all, anyone who would like to pose a question to our speakers, to put your questions in the Q&A box on your screen. And I will come in at the end and field some of these questions to our speakers. To introduce our speakers, Dr. Jareh Das is a curator, writer, and researcher who moves between Nigeria and the UK, working on visual arts projects independently with artists, art institutions, and non centered on the global contemporary. Her current research focuses on contemporary performance art in West Africa, interrogating forms of liveness, community, performativity, and placemaking. She has contributed to publications including the Nka Journal for Contemporary African Art, Bomb Magazine, Artsy, Leonardo, Extra, and DOMUS. Dr. Virginia Nimarkoh is an artist, activist, and social entrepreneur based in London, whose work spans visual art, environmental regeneration, and food justice initiatives. She holds a PhD in fine art, theory and practice from Goldsmiths, University of London. Her photographic work has been exhibited widely, including at ICA in London, Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, the Renaissance Society in Chicago, and Kunstraum Lakeside in Austria. She recently co-directed with Fan Sissoko the film We the People in partnership with the Advocacy Academy and Museum of London. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jareh and Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie, for the invitation, inviting us to speak today. And Jareh and I are going to be speaking about two works of Donald Rodney's. We're going to be speaking about, my screen's blocked. We're going to be speaking about Flesh of My Flesh and In the House of My Father. So Jareh, I wanted to ask you, how did you arrive at Donald Rodney's work initially? What's your first point of entry?
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, Melanie, for that introduction as well. So I've sort of come to Donald Rodney's work through writing, actually. I came to his work in sort of 2012. I was doing research into artists that I was considering to write about during my PhD thesis. And I was quite struck by Rodney's engagement with sickle anemia, which is an illness that has personally affected me and my family. My late sister lived with the illness and also sort of sadly lost her life due to complications related to this illness. So I've sort of, come to his work through that lens, the personal lens of thinking about loss, and also just the sort of wider impact that this illness has on communities of color, particularly people of African and Afro-Caribbean descent. And, it was really, at the time in 2012, I was going through a process of grief, and it was quite difficult for me to actually engage with his work from critical, theoretical perspective. And it was something that I had to create a space of distance around it. It was too personal. Some of his descriptions about hospitalizations were just, really put up a lot of difficulty for me as a writer and theoretician. But then as time went on, post my PhD thesis, I was sort of engaging with his work and seeing a lot of his work have a renaissance of sorts, as it were, exhibitions like the one that Ian Surgeon curated at Vivid, and also more recently an exhibition that included his work at Space in London. So I think, I took up the challenge again of, really sort of immersing myself in his practice, and, just really astounded how this personal then became, personal position, living with illness, then sort of resonated to wider issues that had to do with social injustice, not just in the UK, race relations in the UK, but also thinking about social justice around the world, connected to the apartheid movement, social justice issues in America, and just the sort of global conversations around the representation and framing of Black masculinity, which I thought drawing these parallels from his personal position and extending that outwards was just something that really moved me. So that's how I came to the work. I wrote an essay for Nka on his work, looking at the metaphoric and aesthetic and critical aspects of his work. Yes, the question is back to you, actually. I know that you knew Donald personally, but it'd be interesting to just hear about your initial encounters and how you got to meet him and got to know him and write about him as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I knew Donald from between 1990 to about to the point of his death in 1998. And so we were both met through an Arts Council traineeship in exhibition programming. So Donald was based at the Ikon and I was based between London and Newcastle. And so we met from time to time on these strange residential courses out in the countryside. And so we got to be friends through that. And Donald was spending increasing amounts of time in hospital. And so the hospital became this kind of focus for his work and his life, really. And he created this kind of social and artistic network around the hospital. Yeah, so that became a sort of site of artistic production. It was a meeting point for his different identities, whether that was as an artist, as a patient, as a friend. And I believe that the art was like a way of him not losing those identities within that kind of medical environment, because, as you know, it's all encompassing and it's quite easy for you to lose a sense of who you are. So the social network of friends who were from all sorts of different backgrounds, there might be, artists, curators, nurses, booksellers, all sorts of people were meeting and helping him to sustain his practice. And there was this kind of extended ritual of visiting, sharing books, jokes, news, and running errands for him. And so that really, I would say, kind of ruptured the conventions of the hospital. So it's basically, you know, most people don't make art from their hospital bed. And Donald was in a regular ward. He didn't have a private room to himself. There were other patients around. So that was something that made him kind of stand out. And equally, that hospital environment, with its kind of relentlessness of the, you know, the routine, the meals, the drugs, the rest of it, that kind of order, it disrupted the kind of normal social conventions of the art world. So you might have, it's impossible for you to kind of maintain any sense of your status within the art world in a hospital setting, you know. So you might have curators visit, or you might have the bookshop manager visit, but their status is quite leveled within the hospital context. And I think Donald took some pleasure in that as well. So yeah, and I wanted to sort of say a little bit about the fact that Donald's world was this site of kind of mischief and laughter and spontaneity, which I think can sometimes get missed in some of the later works because they are quite somber, and you don't necessarily see the dark humour of the early works, like How the West Was Won, one of his early works from 1982. So that I wanted to kind of somehow posit that within the space, because alongside it being a space of pain and of creativity and bravery, that's always evident within his work. So yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at with Donald's work practice. And also, like you, I've come to this position of having written about Donald's work and having to take that sort of critical distance back from writing about someone who's my friend to Donald Rodney the artist, and there's a kind of more violence, if you like, that takes place because you have to remove yourself emotionally from that relationship with the person. And I also found it quite a challenge, you know, to talk about Donald in the sense of Donald Rodney the artist. So I think there's a kind of shared tension there that we both experience.
Thank you for that. Yeah, certainly the sort of difficulty and emotion, and also wanting to do justice to the artists as well, and their legacy is also, you know, that also comes into the writing process as a challenge as well. So can we have the first slide, please? Okay, so we're going to talk through about two works that Donald Rodney made in the last 18 months of his life. In the House of My Father, which is the first slide that you can see here, and another work called Flesh of My Flesh, which we'll move on to talking about later. And so really, the image that we're looking at, for me, is a really sort of poignant work that Donald made, as I said, during the time that he was in hospital. And it's sort of quite large-scale work where there's a delicate structure in the palm of his hand, which is sort of pinned together. It's actual skin that has come from surgical procedures, which is remodeled as a house pinned together. And the work, you know, is really speaks to a lot of things. Actually, it speaks about sort of thinking through working with the body in a way that is looking more internally, or sort of giving a perspective on the internalized process of the body, and then also speaking to a narrative as the son of immigrants who had moved to the UK and faced a number of challenges, or having this aspiration of moving to the UK and coming into this land of promise, but were confronted by the realities and the challenges of being Black immigrants, economic immigrants who'd moved to the UK to build a better life, and all the obstacles that they face. And also maybe one thing to mention about the work is that Donald had made this work as a sort of homage to his father, whose funeral he couldn't attend because he was in hospital at the time, and just sort of speaking to ideas around loss and grieving and just the fragility of human life, and also the sort of structures that symbolize that, like the home and the house, really. I don't know if you wanted to add something to this, Virginia, about the work.
Yeah, I would. I mean, for me, this work and the next work we're going to speak about, they sort of mark a transition in Donald's work, because they were made in the last 18 months of his life, and he was spending increasing amount of times in hospital, and some of these, if I remember correctly, this photograph was actually taken in the hospital.
Yeah, it was.
So the hospital becomes, the studio. It becomes, as well as his place of treatment. It's also a photograph of an artwork as well. So that house, the small house made of Donald's skin, is called My Mother, My Father, My Sister, My Brother, from 1996. So, you have this kind of two artworks in one in this particular piece, and it's a way of kind of capturing the fragility of that piece of work, which is held together just literally with pins and tape. So is a conservationist nightmare, really, but is fixed within the photographic space. So I think this work's important as well, in that Donald was using his own body very directly, and in the past he had used his body in terms of having used his own blood at times. He had used X-rays, remnants of the medical processes, but here he's within the frame himself. So he's kind of taking centre stage, which is a different strategy to what it had previously. And I'd probably say that part of this shift was his decreasing mobility, and bringing together other technicians, other artists, to enable him to produce the work that needed to be made. So,
I mean, for me, I was also interested in this idea of what the home represents, actually, and this notion of perhaps this is speaking more to a personal biography, and the aspiration of building a home, and the aspiration of sort of building a home and putting roots down, and perhaps how illness and loss just disrupts all of that, actually, just a really symbolic representation of the fragility of life, really, and all of these things that represent security or sort of rootedness. And this image really sort of challenges that, actually, ways that I find really powerful and moving, as it were. And also coming back to this idea of using fragments of the body, like skin, skin that is the trace of a surgical procedure, that then becomes this material for conceptualizing and rethinking about notions of one's identity, and also aspirations and dreams, really.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think one of the things about this image is that it's kind of taken on a almost iconic status in relation to Donald's work, and it feels like it's open enough for people to be able to invest what they want into it, whatever narrative they want into it, which I think is a strength, but possibly a weakness as well, in that it can be owned by or appropriated by lots of different agendas, if you like. So I'd be interested in seeing, you know, how it can be reclaimed in a way in relation to maybe what Donald's original objective was for the piece.
Can you move on to the next image, please? Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just start by describing what we see in the image. So we've got a triptych, 3 different panels, and it's quite a large work also as well, almost 2 meters across. And the images on either side, left to right of the central image, are electron microscopic representation of hair, hair belonging to Donald Rodney and Ross Finley, Rose Finley, and in the central image, it's an image of a surgical scar, post-operation surgical scar, close up, which belongs to Donald Rodney. And so what's really interesting about the image is that it's really speaking to, you know, this idea of, I suppose, a sort of scientific interpretation of, you know, of sort of under the microscope. These 2 individuals, Black artists and white artists, you know, their hair is the same. But of course, in actuality, in real life, as collaborators on the piece, their race played quite a contested role in terms of how both of these artists came together in collaboration, created a sound piece that was quite difficult for either of them to work on and collaborate on. And the central image, you know, this close-up of a scar is really speaking to, you know, this idea of the scar as a remnant of a surgical procedure, is symbolic of healing. We don't see the wound, but we see that it's in a process of healing and transformation, alluding to the sense that, you know, there's a recovery or a getting better. But on close examination, you know, we sort of see that the scar is really, there's not a lot of care attended to in that surgical procedure, with this misconstrued notion that Black skin is tougher, so it can be handled in ways that aren't sensitive to the actual person, or sort of not precisely taken care of actually in this sort of medical approach. And you know, also this idea of sort of fragmenting the body, you know, where we take away the markers of a body and think about it in this sort of microscopic fragmented lens, speaking to ideas around pain and race and the construction around that really.
Yeah, I think with this piece, it's probably one of the most abstract of Donald's work. And for me, it's like there are these 2 elements. So there's this overworked scar, which is the site of a trauma. So it's the trauma of the illness. And it's also the site of a traumatic event where the scar is almost an abuse by the surgeon, who feels that this level of overwork is necessary on this Black body. And that is also juxtaposed with these electron micron images of hairs. So you have the hair of a white blonde white woman and a black man, and there's no difference at that microscopic level. So there's this tension between the two pieces, and it's almost like a kind of like he's trying to show this healing with the tying of the knot. In my mind as well, with this piece, The Truth Dare Double Dare, which was this very tortured collaboration between Donald Rodney and Rose Finn-Kelcey. They had struggled to come up with a sort of cohesive and a piece that was, I suppose, that suited both their needs at the end of the day. But here Donald's kind of taken remnants of that collaboration, because they produced lots of other material beyond the sound piece. It's almost like he's trying to recuperate that collaboration into something cohesive. So we end up with something quite poignant, really, for me. And I was thinking also about this, the idea of the crisis, like the sickle cell crisis. So for people who don't know, when somebody who experiences sickle cell is experiencing a lot of symptoms, extreme pain, it's called a crisis, a sickle cell crisis. But in Donald's work, there was always this sense of other crises going on. So there's this crisis of faith as coming from a Christian family and not having found a particularly welcoming environment within the church, a crisis of confidence as an artist who spends a lot of time in hospital, and an identity crisis where all these different identities kind of come together and sometimes work and sometimes don't. So for me, I see Donald's work as a way of kind of turning a crisis into an opportunity for creativity, and also for resisting the limitations of those crises.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you raised, actually. Just the ways that he really overcame limitations, especially, just not sort of resigning to the fact that because he was in hospital for long spells of time, that would limit his creative practice, in terms of, even as you described at the beginning, how this setting became a non-hierarchical space for art, also for, working with the constraints of this sort of highly regulated space where care and medication and therapy and all of those things, treatment also had to happen simultaneously. And, I guess for me, what's also really powerful as well was the fact that he was also always paying close attention to really sort of bringing in the things around him into the work, with the use of x-rays, even this image, just thinking of a microscopic image juxtaposed back into a photographic image, and really looking at taking the internal outwards as well, and sort of, the sort of personal, as it were, became public through a work like this, actually, beyond the sort of body as we think of it as a wholesome image as a whole, into these fragmentary parts for considering more closely and critically as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say that, within that hospital space, the external world was brought in often by friends and family. So they're talking about, a time where we didn't necessarily have it's like the early days of internet, and so we wouldn't have had internet at the hospital. Just Donald had a mobile phone, so technology was very much in a different place to where it is now. But it makes me think about, you know, the situation we're in at the moment with the pandemic and how we've been isolated and separated, and it made me wonder what life would have been like had we had these technologies like we're talking over Zoom at the moment, but whether that fact of actually having to go to the hospital to visit Donald and having to take, you know, if he'd asked for the latest edition of, I don't know, Art Monthly or something, you know, someone would actually physically go to the shop, buy it and take it into him. You know, it wasn't kind of, we were his delivery service, you know, so but I feel like that created its own kind of magic, if you like, that enabled different people from different backgrounds, different experiences to kind of come together in ways that we probably wouldn't, well, we definitely wouldn't have been able to remotely, you know. So the effort required to make that journey created a special kind of practice, I would say. So I had a question for you, actually. So I wanted to ask you what you felt Donald's work has to offer younger generation of artists, because you're a different generation from me, and I know that it's speaking to you in quite a different way than it would to me. So in this kind of almost post-pandemic world, what do you feel like Donald's work has to offer now?
Thank you for that question. I mean, you know, as I've sort of come from this, from the, I suppose, recent present, as it were. I mean, I think one of the things that is really sort of, it's really interesting how he was working at the sort of forefront of, you know, really thinking critically about how the medical intersects with the personal, and really probing these questions as to, I mean, now we have a moment where, you know, in terms of like care and, you know, institutional care, and sort of there's a critique around that now, but he was doing that at a time where perhaps you would just accept, you know, convention, and accept or be more accepting, as it were, of you know, the sort of the way that approach, especially from a medical point of view, treating the body, just things were just accepted and considered given, and not really challenging that. And he really sort of, just intersected these labels actually that were projected onto him, and questioned them. So I think, you know, given the sort of recent history and the moment that we're in at the moment, I think he offers to younger artists a way of sort of thinking through multiple lenses, and sort of really thinking about how hierarchies can be dismantled in relation to your work, or how your work is framed. I sort of view him as someone who moved across different disciplines and different spheres as well, from the context of being a Black British artist to an artist whose work got framed within the art science sort of discourse, and then, you know, thinking more of his work in relation to illness as well. So yeah, you know, really sort of intersecting these spaces and critiquing them in ways that I feel were that are still pertinent to now, actually, and a lot of artists can engage with still.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I mean, sort of the question I had for you was, you've really spoken about it, but was just this idea of this hospital setting becoming a space for dismantling hierarchies, and how that was, you know, you were there, you were present at the time, and I guess I was just really thinking about how you reflect on that moment, really in the now, and also, or just, you know, thinking about how more of those spaces, you know, how more of those spaces could exist in a time like now, actually.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that Donald managed to completely dismantle those hierarchies, you know, because they're still very much at play in terms of the stereotypes around Blackness that manifest both in the art world and in the medical world, you know. So, but I feel like he was able to disrupt them, you know, to a degree, and the way that he brought together, you know, curators, doctors, nurses, patients, artists, like all into the same space, and they had to negotiate that space. And as I said before, it was very leveling, you know, and also through this use of the hospital and his illness as this sort of locus for his practice, use of the ephemera, whether it was a wheelchair or the x-rays, or those also kind of subverted his role as patient, you know, because that's not expected. And I feel like Donald's profession as an artist, it kind of brought him a certain amount of credibility than other Black sickle cell patients might have had within the hospital, because, as you know, having sickle cell, there is this of having experience of sickle cell within the family, that there has been a stigma around Black people, Black sickle cell patients being drug addicts, for example, because a lot of the treatment is that's given is painkillers, which some of which are opiates. So there's this sense that, you know, they're not really in pain. They just want drugs, you know. So Donald was able to kind of, you know, because of this persona as an artist as well, it kind of distinguished him from your average patient, your average sickle cell patient. So I feel like there's also this sense of agency within Donald's work, and it makes me think of someone like Audre Lorde and her ideas around radical self-care, and the idea of self-care as a survival strategy and as a political act. So for me, Donald's practice it's like an act of radical self-care, and it's not just for him, but it's for other people as well, because we learn from him. Like, I feel like I've learned from Donald how to manage myself, how to manage my own health, how to manage my own limitations as well. So I feel like from Donald's practice and the way that he lived his life, he's teaching us that, you know, your mental or your physical circumstances don't need to define you, you know, and I think in this situation where we're, you know, in the middle of the pandemic, you know, that's a very powerful gift. Yeah.
Absolutely, I totally agree.
So I feel like maybe we're heading towards where we need to wrap up. But do you feel like we've got Melanie back. Hi, Melanie.
Hi, Melanie.
Hi. But please, if you wanted to continue, I'll hold with my questions. But there are a few, so it's good. It's good. So yeah, shall we go into questions? Is that all right? Yeah.
Yeah, we can go into questions.
Great. Just firstly to say thank you to both of you, and particularly for being so open and candid with what is clearly very personal and poignant experience for you, actually, in relation to Donald Rodney. Just to say, yes, thank you for that. We really appreciate. And to go into questions, I'll start with one, and I'll read this out because it's very detailed about In the House of My Father. And the question goes, I have always viewed In the House of My Father as a crucifixion, The title is a quote from John's Gospel, where Jesus is talking about his approaching death, and Rodney came from a Christian background. The position of the hand is reminiscent of the hands of Christ in traditional images of the crucifixion. The presence of pins in the palm of the hand remind me of nails. Would the speakers agree?
Okay, I'll go first. I had never looked at it like that, but I feel like there is something, you know, as we've said before, iconic about the image. The open hand is a trope within art, going back centuries, and it almost feels like a relic within Donald's hand. So there's definitely some element of religiosity within it. I hadn't seen it as a crucifix myself, but there are, yeah, I can see many parallels, you know, in terms of this was one of Donald's last pieces of work that he made. But then I would wonder what the crucifixion represented in relation to art, you know, that into Donald's art specifically. But I can see the connections with Donald's faith and his use of passages from the Bible as titles for his work that this also relates to. So to a degree, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting reading of the work. I also didn't have those sort of direct associations to a crucifixion. Yes, the biblical connotations in the title of the work, you know, I'm totally aware of that. But I was sort of thinking of it more in terms of being an autobiographical piece directly related to his father. But then, of course, there is the figure of the father in Christian religion that one could sort of also speak to, extending beyond the sort of, I guess, mortal father to this, you know, sort of godlike father as well in the title of the work. I mean, you know, the pins for me in the palm of, you know, my relationship to that is really thinking about a sort of fragile structure and a lack of a permanence also in the structure. If we sort of think about stitching things together, that's more permanent than a pin that just sort of holds things together temporarily, temporality to the work. And of course, yeah, you know, that's sort of my reading of the work. I guess I would ask who was being crucified in that sense, actually, if it was alluding to that, because yeah, basically, I'm not sort of getting that those direct readings to it, actually.
That's really interesting. Also, I'm thinking in light of a conversation that happened yesterday with Keith Piper, also part of the Migrant Festival, that was touching on this relationship with Christianity, actually, and in Keith Piper and Donald Rodney, you know, both being members of the church. But I'm also thinking of your comment at the very beginning of your conversation about how this particular image has, you know, on the one hand, a very specific personal resonance, but then also is very open and has increasingly been infused and invested with these different readings, which all feel legitimate, actually, the way they're described. I'll move on to the next question, which is related to differences in sensitivity of skin in relation to race. I mean, this is a sort of physical, biological question, you know, the information that's out there to support that. And also, I am wondering, Virginia, whether you could offer some insight into this second part of the question, because you spent so much time with Rodney in hospital, and whether Rodney's relationship with surgeons and doctors who treated him, and indeed, do we know the racial background of any of the surgeons, and whether that entered into the equation there, because I suppose thinking again about the intersection with medical conditions and race in what he was doing as well.
Yeah, well, I remember from the time when Donald had this particular operation, this issue with the scar and the overstitching, and the surgeon reporting back to Donald that, you know, he felt that he needed to do these extra stitches because black skin is tougher than white skin. And the surgeon was white. And I think at that time, I don't know if that would have been considered worthy of calling it an assault. We're in a different space now where we might call that an assault on the body. And also, you know, when the deed has been done, what is the, and you're still in hospital and you're still in pain and you're still going to have another operation, you know, can you take on a, you know, case of calling for malpractice at the same time? So that's my my memory of that incident. And I think I think Donald's response and his resistance to that abuse was to make the peace.
Jareh, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'll sort of add that, you know, it's, you know, there's sort of a lot of information out there about racial bias in pain assessment and treatment recommendations. So that sort of feeds into this narrative of black skin being tougher and able to withstand more during some of these procedures, and also thinking, you know, through what that might mean to even sort of take that up at the time, to complain about such a procedure. But you know, it's something that has been shifting and is shifting. But you know, historically there was that notion that, you know, black skin, or, you know, black people had like higher tolerance of being able to withstand pain. Actually, we've sort of seen that through historically from sort of slave trade, really. You know, is where that sort of began. That there was this idea that black people could withstand more suffering. Actually.
And which feels, from the way you describe, as much a projection, you know, really. So yeah, thank you so much for that. This next question firstly starts with a thank you to you both for sharing these images and insights about Rodney's practice. And given that we know that Rodney was making a lot of work from his hospital bed, and a question about how important in his mind the physical embodied encounter with his work was, and how much he was imagining that in space, because again, he was obviously restricted in the extent to which he could, you know, I mean, attend an installation or actually be with his work at that point.
Yeah, I think the physical encounter was incredibly important for Donald. I think there's a sense of almost this fragmentation of the body that's occurring in these two photographic works, and then other works around that time. Psalms, the wheelchair piece, where it's an automated wheelchair that runs by a computer program. There's an absent body in that piece, so that there's a sense of Donald's absence within the work that is emerging around this time. I remember there was an exhibition, I think it was at the Barbican, and Donald was too ill to attend the private view, and Helen Chadwick, the artist, was in the show as well, and she had died like a few months previously. And so I just remember going to this exhibition and seeing, you know, Donald's work was there, he wasn't there, Helen had died, and there was just this one other artist whose work who was there presently, and this just overwhelming sense of absence, you know, and the sense of injustice, I guess, you know, when the body fails, you know, the body fails and the work carries on, the show carries on, you know. But yeah, it's very, very much so in Donald's work, this sense of, I think he was becoming more aware of his separation from the world, but the work itself had this very intense impact, you know, because these are not small pieces of work. They fill a space, they inhabit a space very powerfully.
Jareh, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think certainly this, you know, encounter with the works in space, sort of, you know, you're looking at an image of a sort of magnified image of hair or a scar that then sort of takes up presence. You know, the experience of it is sort of very embodied, very sort of, in a way, sort of confrontational, as it were, in terms of like encountering and really engaging you to look closely. That's something that, you know, would be microscopic or would be just part of the body. I think that's really quite interesting how these, you know, these metaphors for the body become larger than life, as it were, in the gallery space. I think that's certainly something that you see in these works, actually, especially the later works, that really stay with you.
Your point there leads on to another question quite nicely, and this is to do with, I think, increasingly Donald Rodney being ascribed this category or appellation as a disabled artist, and very much, you know, an iconic representative of that. And of course, also increasingly these days, you know, we're recognizing the work of disabled artists and bringing that to the fore in discourses of art. And a question here, wondering what Donald Rodney himself would think if he was here now about being ascribed to that sort of category, and the increasing recognition of and interest in this practice, particularly from the institution and museums and galleries.
Yeah, I think Donald would have struggled with the idea of being categorised as a disabled artist, because he was on a journey with his disabilities, with his body that was taking him into this realm of disability. And he resisted it as much as possible, not from the point of view that he felt that the term disabled artist was lesser, but it put him in a pigeonhole which he was not happy with. You know, if he's contesting Black masculinity, if he's contesting race, if he's contesting religion, all sorts of things, then he would also be contesting this label of disability. So I know that each step on the way of him having to relinquish a freedom because of his disability was very difficult, very challenging for him. So the shift from going from, you know, maybe just using a walking stick to using a wheelchair, or having 2 hip replacements, you know, by the time he was 36, all of those were restricting his physical ability, which I think, you know, enhanced or spurred him on, or was a catalyst for him to produce more work, you know, and to work in ways that were more, so using technology, for example, was a way of him reclaiming some kind of ability which physically he wouldn't be able to do. So that shift from say, painting and sculpture through to using technology and photography and digital tools to produce his work. So yeah, I would say he would resist that term.
Jareh, would you like to add anything to that, or?
I mean, you know, I totally agree with what Virginia has said, and you know, I didn't know Rodney personally, of course, but you know, it always struck me that there was always this quest to really define himself, and you know, it wasn't a case of being defined by others. There was always this reclamation of the self through these different challenges and processes that he was going to, especially when things, you know, became more difficult for him. You know, there wasn't this sort of like handing over to, yeah, you know, sort of outward projection of who we could be actually, and that was where, you know, that's where you sort of really see this, you know, you see in the artwork, you know, that's where the artwork becomes this, I suppose you could probably think of it as bearing witness actually to all of the different ways that he was constantly disrupting these labels and limitations and classifications, and you know, also ways to sort of yeah, define his work really, which is why it's still something that, you know, different people can kind of come to in different ways today. You know, sort of outlived its time as well, actually. Timelessness to his works.
I think that's, you know, it's a really good note probably to end on, because we are at the end of the time we have. But I'll raise this is a question, but perhaps something we can all take away from this talk and just think about further. But in a broader sense, you know, if we think beyond this more limited reading of Rodney in relation just to his illness, but the extent to which his practice was concerned with visualizing the invisible, whether that's, you know, in a social, historical, racial politics, metaphysical sense, you know, it really feels like an underlying question actually in his work. But I will leave it there and wrap things up. But thank you so much, Jareh, Virginia, for your time and for the conversation. And thank you all again, those of you who are here with us today. Just also to say that, as I mentioned at the beginning, this talk is part of the Migrant Festival, which is continuing to happen over the next few days. And there are various events and further talks happening. So please have a look at Ikon's website. You know, lots more going on this very important topic. So without further ado, I'll say again, thanks to all. Thank you to our speakers, and have a lovely afternoon.